Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And you were right, maybe to stop halfway because an introduction, particularly of a bio for a conference, is always difficult to repeat. I mean, what is more important is that you have, an interesting career, interesting life, and that you met interesting people like today here in the academy. You said it yourself. I'm a retired Belgian ambassador, and currently I'm the chairman of the Europe-Asia Center. And in addition to my work business center, I'm also very honored to hold the position of honorary consul general for Japan in the Flemish region, and also, which is a little bit exotic, the vice president of the Princess Elizabeth Antarctica Station. Belgium has a station on Antarctica, a scientific station. I'm the vice chairman of that. And the station is named after the name of the Crown Princess, the daughter of King Philip. But I'm delighted to attend this conference organized by the Academy, and this is the first time for me, and I hope we will have more chances in the future to work together, and I can already see the immense potential, such as a partnership, between the Academy and the Europe-Asia Center can bring. As a former diplomat, each time when I come to Berlin, I'm reminded of the pulse of the European history and European civilization. And during my early career as a diplomat, I had the privilege of witnessing the tectonic shifts and changes in European and German history as a result of the upheavals and eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I can still recall my first visit to Berlin in the 80s, in the 1980s, and the sight of the wall dividing the historic center of Berlin. The dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall remain etched in our memories and for the rest of our lives, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Similarly, the Russian unprovoked invasion of Ukraine last year will also be something that remains vivid in our minds. And recently, Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, spoke about the events in 2022 and the war in Europe, as also mentioned by our friends from Congo. And she stated that it was a year of horror, brutality, and contempt of for mankind by Russia. Ukraine is fighting to protect its sovereignty and to ensure that freedom prevails over slavery. The Ukrainian people's bravery and sacrifices in the face of state terror will always be appreciated and remembered. And the Ukrainians deserve our unwavering support, politically, economically, and militarily. And against this background, ladies and gentlemen, and given the increased military tension in various parts of the world, it may seem me inappropriate to discuss today about soft power or cultural diplomacy and people-to-people exchanges. However, it is not so inappropriate. The Europe-Asia Center, and it's Europe, not just the EU, the Europe-Asia Center has been in operation now for 10 years. And previously, its primary activities included organizing seminars and briefings with European and Asian stakeholders on relevant political issues related to the European Union and its policies in Asia. And due to the COVID pandemic, we, like many others, and I'm sure also here at the center, the Academy, had to reinvent ourselves. And despite this, we were able to continue our work digitally for the past 3 years. However, we also felt it was time to refocus the Europe-Asia Center's mission by promoting the concept of what we call soft power. We believed that a people-to-people dialogue between Europe and Asia was the most effective way to re-engage with our Asian partners after the pandemic and to overcome political differences where they exist. While it is difficult to define soft power, it can be seen as the opposite of military or economic threats. Why is there mutual attraction between Europe and Asia despite their differences? Why do millions of Europeans and Asian tourists visit each other's countries? Why do thousands of students come to Europe to study? Why is there such a fascination in Asia for European football and other sports? And why are so many European entrepreneurs interested in the Asian market and set up businesses there? Why are cultural exchanges such as music and arts between Europe and Asia a regular fixture on the cultural calendars of the great cultural institutions? And why are we attracted by each other's cultural heritage? And why even is Asian cuisine such a significant part of the European culinary palette? This fateful attraction is not new and goes back hundreds of years, with Marco Polo being the pioneer, preceding thousands of others such as missionaries, academics, entrepreneurs and adventurers and others. The attraction to China or Japan in Europe is well known and is sufficiently documented. Many universities in Europe include Chinese or Japanese studies. The ambition to learn the Chinese or Japanese language remains high with the young generation in Europe. And while China, Japan, and I would also add India are mature partners for Europe, other countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, other ASEAN countries are showing great potential for people-to-people exchanges. And the Europe-Asia Center is developing some interesting projects with Vietnam and is going to do more prospecting on Indonesia. Europe is hardly present in the 7 countries of the STAN region, which is regrettable. The STAN region are the 7 countries, in Middle Asia. And Europe-Asia Center is exploring options for developing activities with them. Last year, we successfully organized an exhibition on the Song Dynasty paintings in Brussels and in London. And we engaged in high-level dialogues regarding cultural diplomacy and the EU strategic autonomy. With the input from members of the European Parliament, we had a productive discussion on the recent developments in the field of the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, areas in which European Union leads as a pioneer. And we are planning new events for 2023, so this year. And my colleague Matic will provide more details on the organization of this event. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share some thoughts on this week's conference topic, which is sustainable business and responsible investments. I know the focus this afternoon is on Africa, but allow me, I won't be there tomorrow, so to expand a little bit on some personal views on sustainable business and responsible investment. And as a staunch European and internationalist, one lesson I have learned is that the European Union and its citizens must be less naive. For too long, we believed that the rest of the world shared our values of peace, economic rationality, and sustainable progress. We thought that international trade was beneficial for all and that extreme nationalism was a thing of the past. Unfortunately, events like the war in Ukraine have shown us that unchecked nationalism can lead to economic ruin and human suffering. Food, energy, and other resources become weapons of war, and international trade can be disrupted by conflicts like the trade war initiated by former US President Trump. Many people fear that this tension could escalate into a global conflict, and investors and citizens are all worried that Taiwan could become the next flashpoint on this globe. The EU is now reflecting on its experience and seeking to become more strategically autonomous. This means reducing our reliance on other countries for essential resources such as energy, food, batteries, semiconductors, rare earths and telecommunications, defense and others. Europe does not wish to engage in decoupling, what they call, which would mean limiting trade to only those countries that are our allies. Instead, Europe wants to engage in de-risking. And I look back at the previous speaker this afternoon, de-risking, so that we are not overly dependent on countries that are not our friends. It becomes inevitable that security may come with an economic price and cost for all of us. Yes, since the war in Ukraine, the EU has become less naive, but some countries have yet to fully grasp the lesson. They remain trapped in old world thinking before the 24th February of 2022, as evidenced by hesitations by some countries to arm Ukraine further. However, the challenge facing our industry is significant, as we need to enable multiple transitions simultaneously. The most crucial transition is towards achieving climate neutrality by 2050. As an intermediate goal, there is now a legal obligation in the EU to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% on average by 2030. Additionally, by 2035, the EU aims also to have all new cars fully electric. And you know this is a big issue, particularly in Germany, where there is so much to do about Das Auto. Achieving these goals will require enormous investments and a different business model for many companies, as well as a change in the way of life for many citizens. The EU is not sitting idly as it prepares for this major transition. Europe must stay ahead of the competition. It must continue investing in strengthening our industrial base and making Europe more investment, more innovation friendly. This is precisely what investors are looking for across the global market. In Europe, the EU has taken the lead with the European Green Deal to pave the way towards climate neutrality by 2050. And it has enshrined its net zero target in law to provide predictability and transparency that business need. It has also followed up with the Next Generation EU and other instruments across the economy. The unprecedented investment in clean technology spans across all sectors of the green transition. Clean tech is now the fastest growing investment sector in Europe, which is value doubling between 2020 and 2021 alone. A European industrial policy is necessary, and if Europe is not competitive, it cannot achieve strategic autonomy. It is that simple. Until recently, the term industrial policy was taboo in the EU. And that is different now. An industrial policy is more than the addition of national policies. It must be truly a European policy. The future of industry in Europe is at stake. Europe is winning the energy war with Russia on supplies, but is losing the one with the US on prices. It has already had to deal with dumping practices because of China, but now the US has started protective measures. It is far from the Obama era when the European Union negotiated a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, the TTIP. That would be a kind of free trade agreement. Today, it is more of Buy America. Concerns are high in the EU, although the tone is muted for now, because we do not want to give the impression of division on both sides of the Atlantic when we have a common enemy in the war. However, that does not change the economic reality. Europe needs to address these problems and many others, such as migration, demography, globalization, while the war rages on its borders. On their own, climate and competitiveness would already sufficiently fill the political and social agenda. The war makes it much more difficult, although it is truthful to say that, for instance, on energy, it could speed things up over time. We are currently living in dangerous times. The Europeans are naturally skeptical of their institutions. However, when I look around me, I wonder who is in decline. The war in Ukraine is more than a power struggle. It is a clash of civilizations. It is a confrontation between two views of humanity, between the value of every human being and the glory of the nation and the state. That is why the West is so determined. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful to have been given this opportunity to present the Europe-Asia Center and also to share some of my personal ideas regarding the challenges the European is currently facing and the years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, of course. I would like to take time for questions and discussion, and we do have some time now, which is good. I'd encourage you to take advantage of it because sometimes it gets very busy and we don't have time, but today it's good. So I'd be very happy to have any comments, any questions. I think it's a great example of cultural diplomacy also, the work of the center. But maybe also some of the graduate students have questions too. A practitioner who's seen it in the public state, in the public sense as ambassador, yeah, and now in the private sense. Yes, okay, I'll start here. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Ryan Yeager. I'm from the United States. So the comments you're making regarding how there's like these two conflicting worldviews, the value of humanity versus like the glory of like a nation and state, and how policy has shifted from the Obama administration to now through two different presidential administrations now. I guess, and this is a very broad question, and obviously it's difficult to answer, but I guess how do you start to shift those worldviews? Because while I think it's a slightly different scope than, say, the war in Russia and Ukraine, the United States, I think, is very much still oriented towards that, or sympathetic to that glory of itself and putting like Buy American and those sorts of things ahead of global interests. So how can the United States or even any country around the world start to shift towards global humanitarian interests rather than their own self-interests?
Yes, I think to answer your question, which of course is very global and even philosophical, and it's maybe could spend some time on it. But let me try to answer it in terms of, the political idea of. I wouldn't call it an ideology, but I think I used the phrase somewhere in my speech. It's about freedom and sometimes, slavery. It's about democracy and authoritarianism. I think those are not new concepts. They existed already for a very long time. But now they come, of course, that the world is changing. The world is changing very fast. And you can see that it is not so that, like in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, that China didn't exist. I mean, existed, of course, but not as a power. The Soviet Union was still in existence, and it was very powerful. Today, Russia is in a very different situation. So once you get this big, movements on the political field, geopolitical field, it is really something you try to reduce it to very simple concepts. And I think it's true. That's what we are facing now. I personally have been extremely upset by what happened in Ukraine. I have always been, as a diplomat, we always try to look for dialogue. We always try to look for compromise. We always try to look to the middle ground. But all of a sudden I said to myself, where is the middle ground here? That you are so blatantly, so violently, so unjustified, so unprovoked, be attacked as a country, sovereign country, member of the United Nations, and even the people of Ukraine couldn't believe it. So for me, that has been a terrible shock. So I'm sometimes, as a diplomat, you should always look for the middle ground. But here I feel I have to take position. That's one thing. On the economic front, of course, the economy continues, and it should. I think the economy is doing in some parts of the world very well. But of course, because of you get this political antagonism, that you also create more and more antagonism, in the economic field. I mentioned some concepts which are new for Europe. What they call the strategic autonomy, not to be relying too much on other countries. We saw that during the pandemic. That's there were no masks, for instance. In Europe, we had to buy them all from China, which is fair enough. But I think we have to be prepared. We should not rely too much for our essential supplies on countries on which, where we have differences. I mean, I'm not saying that international trade should only be trade between, as some people say, this decoupling between countries of the same alliance. That's not the case. I believe in trade. And if you see, for instance, the trade between the EU and China, there where we have some friction, it's only 5% of the trade bulk. The bulk of trade we have between China and the EU. All the rest is trade. We still import a lot. The United States import a lot from China. So and I hope it will continue, because decoupling would certainly not be the remedy. So that's how I see it. But on the philosophical discussion or political discussion, I'm willing to go much more in detail on that. Thank you.
Additional comments, questions? Okay. Well, actually, I want to save this. So the ones in the front, I'll do them.
Thanks for your viewpoints, Mr. Steele. I had a couple of questions. I think everybody knows who I am from the previous speech. Two sort of related questions. The first is the war sort of exposed EU's dependence from an energy standpoint on Russia, which now is sort of being remedied. How do you see that playing out in the long run, and in terms of, is EU going to be self-reliant or will move to different sources across the world? So that's one question. And then the second, which is related question, is you talked about green energy, clean energy, or just the goals for EU itself, but it doesn't end there, because you still have the rest of the world. So how does EU bring the rest of the world to meet, if not the same standards, but at least make a step in the right direction?
Yeah. Maybe first your question on energy and how we are still very much reliant on fossil energy, fossil fuels, and particularly gas. And I'm sure we are here in Germany, they know very, very well what it means. And it has been an amazing year that you, in such a short time, you were able to, become less dependent on gas, particularly the gas from Russia. New sources of supply have been found very, very quickly, and I think for the time being we are fine. So this year everyone was saying it's going to be a very difficult winter for Europe. So we managed to get through it. So doesn't mean that next winter will be okay. So it's going to be a big challenge the coming months to indeed to diversify your sources of energy. So I also mentioned the Green Deal in Europe, which is taken very seriously in Europe, and we have taken some very dramatic steps. So we should be completely, our CO2 impact by 2050 should be nil. It's a big challenge. So there's an intermediate step, as I mentioned, 2030. And then, of course, we had the big discussion. I'm not sure if you followed that discussion. It's on the cars, the emissions of cars, which is they want to actually by 2035, we want to be 100% electric, our cars. Of course, this is been a big political discussion, and I think it's now, particularly in Germany, it's a hot issue, and I don't want to predict what it's going to be as an outcome. But this is certainly extremely important. So you mentioned also, well, Europe tries to be a leader, but we do it in the way Europe is organized. We have this. We work together as 27 countries, and we have this policy driven by the European Commission. Of course, other countries are also taking major steps. I'm mentioning even the Chinese are taking enormous steps in terms of greening their economy. They are very much ahead in electric cars and batteries. I know that the United States is taking major steps, and particularly under the Biden administration. It's probably not as, it sounds very spectacular, but I think the steps which are now taken in the United States are indeed going in the right direction. But also we live as allies together, so we have to talk to each other, and I think that's very important. So that the Americans and the Europeans talk to each other on indeed, the greening of their economies. What the other countries are concerned, and I'm happy to see a lot of African countries here today. I think here again we need to share our technology. This is not technology for one region in the world. I hope we can share that, and I think this is on the agenda of all our programs of cooperation and collaboration with African countries. So this is something we want to do because we are all on the same in the same boat. Environment doesn't stop in Europe or doesn't stop in China. It's a global issue, and this global issue we have to address in a global way. Even when there are political differences, we still have to work to talk about those issues, because it's about the survival of our planet. It's as simple as that.
Additional comments, questions? If not, then we could always continue in the coffee break. There is a brief coffee break now. But all right, then on that occasion, let me express again on behalf of the Academy our sincere gratitude to Mr. Piet Steele.
Thank you.